Welcome to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. With me today is the Pablo Picasso to my chalk artist, Professor Richard Toye, and our special guest today, an eminent scholar, Tim Riley, the art curator and director at the Churchill Museum in Fulton, Missouri. Thank you for being here today, Tim.
Well, thank you, Warren. Thank you, Richard. It's always great to talk about this particular topic, which is a passion of mine.
So we're going to be focusing in these next two episodes in our conversation with Tim, Churchill as a painter and what we can learn from this topic about his career more generally. I guess let me sort of put a tough question out there as a starter, Tim. How good was Churchill as a painter, do you think?
Well, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, is it not? So I really let others answer that. But in my opinion, as one who's been fortunate enough to see probably over 400 of his canvases over the years, I can say he was quite good as a painter. Though Churchill himself insisted from early on that he was an amateur. He was not a professional. He did not aspire to be a professional painter at all. He did not aspire to exhibit his paintings. He was an amateur in the truest sense of that word, in that he loved to paint. And I think that for him and it shows. He had a certain joy. He writes that painting for him was like a joy ride in a paint box. And I think the act of painting for him was something that he truly, truly loved, and it's infectious when you see it. So I think the public, well, when they see Churchill's paintings, and again, he did not paint to exhibit. So it's unusual, I think. It would have been unusual for him to see such a response. But the public senses that joy that he had for the painting. So in that respect, I think he's a remarkable artist because he can connect with an audience. And from a technical perspective or from an art historical perspective, from a critical perspective, others can debate and decide as they do. But I think for that reason of Churchill's ability to connect his artwork with the general public, I think he's an extraordinary painter.
Yeah. I mean, I guess we'll kind of keep coming back to this question. I mean, I suppose I would say I think there are some of his paintings that are genuinely excellent. The one which is in Chartwell, which I particularly like, is one called Bottlescape, which is a still life, which is quite different really from a lot of them that he does. And, some of them don't always hit the mark, in my opinion. But as you say, it's kind of like we've got to judge him for what he was trying to achieve, and not, one might well say that he had sufficient talent that had he decided to do this full time from an early age, then he might well have been a very successful or a great artist. But as you say, he was an amateur, and we do have to take what he was doing in that light.
Well,
To that degree.
Oh, go ahead, Tim. Sorry.
Well, to that end, Pablo Picasso agrees with you, Richard. He said the same thing. If Churchill had spent more time studying painting, he might have been an extraordinary painter. That comes from Picasso himself. So I think that there's something to that.
And equally, if Picasso had spent more time on politics, he could have been a great prime minister.
Well, I was just going to say, from my perspective of looking and studying Churchill paintings, I've seen a lot of his, I'm going to say, Middle Eastern works or North African works, where he's clearly flirting with, sort of Orientalist ideals and things that come into the language of his paintings. So I'm quite interested in that and sort of always have been. But one of the things I think is remarkable in those works, which are some of my favorite, for instance, the one, of course, that he gave to FDR that I think Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie recently had and then auctioned off. It's of the mosque, I believe, in Marrakesh.
Yeah, the Koutoubia Mosque. Right. Yes. It's in Marrakesh. You're correct.
Yeah, that is a remarkable painting. And one of the things I like in his paintings is his sort of eye for architectural detail, particularly when it is this sort of Orientalist thing. And there's some where he's done the markets of Marrakesh, and he's got figures in it. They're not particularly great. But what is interesting in the figures, I think, is that they're very vivacious. They're always doing things. There's an old woman with a donkey I'm thinking of in one particular painting of the market of Marrakesh. And I've always, there's something about him connecting with people, and you see that in the painting, for me, in those, particularly in those Middle Eastern paintings. And of course, one of the real interesting ones, and maybe you're aware of it, Tim, the Wallace collection, I think right now has their show on in London, which is some of Churchill's paintings. And I was invited to comment on his painting that he did in 1921, Jerusalem, which I think is a remarkable painting. And we can get into my thoughts on that later. But just the complexity of the painting and what it's communicating, even though I think it's quite technically a kind of normal painting for, a sort of Edwardian gentleman, I still think it's a fairly remarkable painting, what it tells us about Churchill and maybe his view of that space. We can get into that later. Also, I'm not an art historian. I'm an amateur art historian, like Churchill was an amateur painter.
Well, give it a go. Give it a go.
Let's pick up that point about how he actually came to painting. I don't know, Warren, do you want to kind of set the scene for Gallipoli in 1915 and what had gone wrong with Churchill's career for those listeners who may not be familiar with this part of his political story?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, Richard. So, as devotees to the show will know, and to Churchill books, Churchill had been in charge of forcing the Dardanelles, and it ultimately led to the Gallipoli campaign during the First World War against the Ottoman Empire, and it went devastatingly wrong. And Churchill took the political brunt of having misplanned this, although most historians, including the late, great Christopher Bell, argued that it wasn't necessarily Churchill's fault. It's a much more complex kettle of fish than you might think. But Churchill certainly publicly and politically took the failure and this bothered him immensely. In fact, he even had issues with depression around this. And so from that point forward, he was looking for sort of a release. He's in kind of a dark place. And I believe, and you correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, he went to New Buildings in 1911 on vacation. No, it's after 1914. I'm sorry. What year was it? It's after
It was June. It was June of 1915 is when he first picked up a brush. So you're right.
So he was at New Buildings, I think. Is that no? It's not New Buildings. It was the Hoe Farm. That's it.
Right. And I think, you've got it spot on. After the Dardanelles, after Gallipoli, it was a catastrophic blow for Churchill. And as you suggest, his family was worried about his mental health. He was, before that, had a meteoric rise within politics. And after that failed campaign, and again, historians will debate whether or not he was to blame, but the public reaction was such that Churchill was condemned for Gallipoli and the failure there. He retreated to Hoe Farm in Surrey in England. It was a cottage that was rented by Clementine and Winston, along with Churchill's brother Jack and his wife Gwendolen. They called her Goonie in the family. And it was June of 1915. Churchill was still in the dumps, if you will, after being forced to resign his position as First Lord. And he was admiring his sister-in-law, Gwendolen Goonie, painting, and he picked up a brush, and she encouraged him and said, Winston, I think this might be good for you. And he rather timidly approached a canvas. He had not ever picked up a brush before. He was 40 years old. He did not have art classes in school. He didn't pick up a crayon, didn't pick up a brush, was not an artist, had no real opportunity to engage in the visual arts other than as a viewer, surrounded by splendid paintings and tapestries at Blenheim Palace, perhaps, as a child and in his youth. But he gave it a go in 1915, timidly at first. And it was really with Gwendolen's help, and also Hazel Lavery, an artist, wife of Sir John Lavery, encouraged Churchill to pick up the biggest brush, she said, and douse it in the canvas or in the palette, pick up the blue and attack the canvas. And when Churchill heard the phrase "attack the canvas," I think something clicked for him. And he writes in his wonderful essay, "Painting is the Pastime," that he never turned back. And from that point onward, he found that painting came to his rescue after the Dardanelles, and was life-changing, that moment. He found refuge in it was the original art therapy.
Yeah, I mean, I have a quotation here because he wrote about this, and we'll come to the essay later, Painting as a Pastime, but he talks about how at this point he's been, as you say, he's been forced out of the Admiralty. He's been given this position as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, where he's still a minister, but he doesn't really feel that he's kind of having any power. He's just kind of almost notionally a minister. And he sort of says that this sort of shift left me gasping like a sea beast fished up from the depths, or a diver too suddenly hoisted. My veins threatened to burst from the fall in pressure. I had great anxiety and no means of relieving it. And he goes on, and he's sort of talking about as well. Remember that the war is obviously ongoing, and he's now kind of watching it almost as a spectator without having any capacity to have an influence on it. And so it's in that situation that he sort of launches into this new hobby. I was just going to mention, in the light of what you said, that in his career as a journalist in the 80s, he had kind of done some sketches, I think, of the Cuban campaign, which actually shows some talent there. So I kind of don't want to do this thing where I say, well, Churchill said he was an amateur, but actually he had loads of experience. He's obviously concealing something. I think he obviously did feel that, sort of pressure when he was sort of confronted with a canvas, didn't really know what to do. This was a new field for him. But he did have, he'd already established that he could do drawing, which clearly was a foundation, some kind of foundation, and maybe he'd kind of, forgotten about this or didn't even really rate it as a skill. But those earlier drawings that he did, I think they were publishable. So he was. I think that also he kind of says again in the essay he didn't really know anything about painting. He didn't really have any influences, which we will come to. At the same time, he must have been aware of various artists who he must have seen, even if he didn't pay too much attention to them. Subconsciously, some of this stuff must have had an effect on him.
I think you're right, Richard.
Sorry, Tim. Yeah, one of my favorite quotes, and this goes back to what you were saying, Tim, about painting really coming to his rescue. And the reason I confused Hoe Farm with New Buildings is because his friend from New Buildings, Wilfred Scowen Blunt, whose biography I happen to have right here, actually was there and wanted to come check on Churchill because he had heard that he had been down in the dumps and he had been friends with Churchill's father. And, there was this, Churchill's father had a very sort of difficult decline, public decline. And so if you read this book, he wanted to go check in on Winston, make sure he wasn't sort of losing his mind in the same way his father was. And he goes there, and Churchill, according to Blunt's diary, said that, he held out his hands, which were covered in paint. And he said, look, these hands really should be covered in blood from what happened with the Ottoman Empire. And you can see that kind of mental health stuff work out, and that much distressed Wilfred Blunt. But then Wilfred also reflects on the fact that this seems to be healing to Churchill to be able to do this. I've always thought that was really remarkable. Even that intimate a discussion among friends of mental health and painting at this time is really, I think, revealing.
Well, I think that's an excellent point, Warren, in that you use the word intimate. Even the essay, Painting is a Pastime, is an extraordinarily intimate look at Churchill's life and career and moment, not only in that period. He writes Painting as a Pastime first in essay form, 5-6 years after Gallipoli, so he had a little time to reflect upon it. But it's an extraordinarily personal essay. And I often, people ask me, if I could read something by Winston Churchill, what one book would you recommend reading? And I often say that book. It published in book form in 1948, Painting as a Pastime, is a glimpse inside Churchill's head in a way that's remarkably intimate and remarkably personal, and like his painting itself. And I think that's, again, one of the reasons people are attracted to him as a painter, because he goes on a limb and he lets you inside and he sees that, which is something that is quite remarkable.
So maybe that's a good time to go for a break. Welcome back to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour, where Warren, Doctor, and I are talking to Tim Riley about Churchill's painting. We've sort of touched on, but haven't gone into much depth yet, about the influences on Churchill, both in terms of painters who he might have seen their work and subconsciously influenced him, and those who actively tried to teach him and succeeded in teaching him. Tim, could you say something about that?
Yeah, I don't know if they taught him. I'm paraphrasing here, but I think the sentiment is that Churchill imagined that he liked to learn but didn't like to be taught.
Yeah,
And I think that's a case here too. But he was surrounded, fortunately, by some professional and rather accomplished painters. Sir John Lavery was an early influence. Sir John was a neighbor at one point of Winston Churchill's. His wife, Hazel, was the one who encouraged
Mm.
Churchill to pick up a brush and give it a go. He was one Churchill painted side by side in his studio with Lavery. In fact, there's a terrific painting by Winston Churchill of Sir John Lavery at an easel. And there's a companion portrait opposite, really, of Churchill painted by Lavery. The two were very close and couldn't help but learn from one another. And I think that's important too, because Churchill, for instance, with another colleague and friend of his, the French painter, Paul Maz and Winston Churchill met in the trenches, after the Dardanelles, of course, and after Hoe Farm, when Churchill picks up a brush, not long after, he goes to the front. And the former First Lord of the Admiralty is Lieutenant Colonel Churchill with his men in the trenches. And he brought with him his paint box and his canvas. He painted on the front line and met there an artist named Paul Maz. They became lifelong friends. And Maz was another influence on Churchill. Interesting as an aside, those moments in the trenches when Churchill is painting in the lull moments in between the shelling and the barbed wire and the machine guns. Churchill used his time to paint, and there's some extraordinary paintings from that period of Plug Street and others from 1916 that capture that moment for Churchill. And interestingly enough, I find it fascinating. I think we know now that, the kilometers away on the other side of the line, there was another young officer on the German lines, also frustrated, or not, he was a frustrated painter named Adolf Hitler. So we have these two men of history, painters, if you will, in the First World War, on opposite sides of the trenches, which I find fascinating. Of course, they never met, of course, at the time, but it's a remarkable happenstance of history.
I have an interesting question. It's a Paul Maz question, actually. I've always been interested in Churchill and Paul Maz's relationship, and one of my and this is sort of an annoying question. I have a Paul Maz, which he did of the south of France, and I want to say it's maybe from the 30s or 40s. But I know that he and Churchill were in correspondence at that time, and I've always thought a fun thing for me in the last 20 years is to try to collect people that Churchill had a relationship with. How much influence do you think, Tim, Paul Maz had on Churchill's eye or style? And how much is this original Paul Maz I've got worth?
Well, the market for those, the market for the painters you described, Paul Maz, Lavery, Walter Sickert, who else? William Nicholson, Charles Montag. These are all other artists with whom Churchill worked and were influencers on Churchill's work. All of these artists were successful in their own right, far more successful in their own time than Churchill was, but I think are seeing a resurgence in some ways because of their connection with Winston Churchill and his resurgence, or his not just resurgence, but his recognition now today as a painter. Those other artists, their reputations rise because of Churchill, which is ironic. Paul Maz, he painted with Winston Churchill frequently, especially in the 1930s. In fact, it was Paul Maz who recounts in the 1960s, the story. Churchill was painting with Paul Maz in France, and a young man comes up with a cable, and Churchill has his easel there, and Maz has his easel, and they're painting, and Churchill put down his brushes to read the cable, and it says, "You're needed back in England. Suggest you come because there could be a job for you." This is 1939. This is right before the German invasion of Poland. The situation is worsening, and Churchill tells Maz, "You finish that painting because you might not have a chance to do another one for another number of years." Churchill knew that the war was looming. So really, it was with Maz that Churchill was called back to England, knowing full well that the situation in Europe was there. So painting was at him, with him at some of these most important moments in Churchill's life. And Maz was there on the front lines for sure.
One more sort of annoying question. Sorry, Richard, my apologies. We recently hosted a show around conspiracy theories and Winston Churchill. And of course, Walter Sickert's name came up and his relation to Jack the Ripper. I just want to know if you think he's Jack the Ripper.
I don't.
Nor do I. Nor does anyone, really, I think, besides Patricia Cornwall.
I wonder if we can turn to the sort of the milieu around Churchill and some of these paintings that you mentioned. I guess, what were the fashions in painting? What were the sort of the styles which may have affected Churchill? I mean, there's a very interesting, I just sort of preface this by saying there's a very interesting bit in a painting with a painting as a pastime, where he says that a French friend who perhaps was Mars is walking with him around a museum, and sort of Churchill stops and looks at the ones that he likes, and the friend says, well, I can sort of tell from sort of the way that you paint the pictures that you're going to like. And Churchill's comment on this in the book is, well, I didn't really have any influences. I didn't know any of these painters. I just sort of kind of instinctively launched in, which, I mean, again, I'm sure is true, but he must have done it instinctively, yet having some awareness of the kinds of stuff that people painted at the time.
I think Churchill picked up a brush for the first time in 1915, and at that point, the explosion of modernism had happened in Europe. Picasso's early Cubist paintings, George Braque, those were the fashions of the day, and those paintings did not appeal to Churchill at all. He was 40 or 50 years behind.
I think maybe you could do that answer again. I think you've dropped out for a second.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Right. Churchill was 40 or 50 years behind the taste. He was much more interested in the post-impressionists and impressionists. He loved Cézanne, for instance, was fascinated by the colors of Van Gogh, those bold colors. Those were the paintings that really inspired Churchill, and painters that inspired Churchill. And of course, the places and locations that those painters painted. Churchill loved the south of France, and like Cézanne, spent many months in holidays with his paintbrushes in the south of France, in large part because of the color and the light. That was one of the things that fascinated Churchill. And Warren, it goes back to what you were saying about his paintings in the Middle East, painting in Marrakesh, painting in Egypt. The light in the desert was extraordinary for Churchill, and I think that's what interested him as much as anything else, was the challenge of capturing the light and the reflections of water and light and storms coming in, the contrast, all of these things you see time and time again in Churchill's paintings. And it's very much in keeping with a more romanticized version than the modernism that was exploding in 1915 when he began to paint. So Churchill was going back 40 or 50 years, but that was part of his joyride for sure.
I wonder if I could ask about Churchill's studio at Chartwell. Obviously, he was kind of pretty well resourced. He was able to buy the materials. He could hang out with people who knew about art, and he kind of built this entire studio. So I just wonder if you can sort of cast any light on sort of the history of the studio, how much time he spent there, and so forth.
Churchill's studio is ground zero for the study of Churchill paintings. To this day, if you visit Chartwell, you can visit the studio and see 100 canvases, many of them unframed, almost as if Churchill had left the studio moments before. That is the largest single collection of Churchill paintings in the world is still preserved in the studio at Chartwell. Though I think Churchill loved to paint in plein air. He painted outdoors, and he would paint with his friends like Paul Maz and others in exotic locations in France. But he would often go back to the studio and pick up the painting again to work on it further, often from photographs. Walter Sickert was one who encouraged Winston Churchill to use photographs and a slide projector, or magic lantern, as he called it, project some of these images onto the canvas to help him with perspective and other things like that. It was a useful device for Winston Churchill. So he used the studio as a place to do that, but he would often start his paintings out of doors in plein air and finish them in his studio. But it's a great place, and it's a must visit for anyone who's interested in Churchill's, because you're surrounded by these canvases, and again, many of them are unframed. They look like they've just come off the easel.
Do you want to come in with a question, Warren? Because I've done a few.
Well, yeah. So I guess, do you do much work? I mean, obviously, you will know Catherine Carter at Chartwell, having been to the studio, and then of course Barry Phipps, who I think controls the Coombs collection. And I just wonder about, do you all regularly communicate? I mean, for instance, one of the things about the art world is anytime there's someone that claims they have an original Churchill, but it's not in the collection or it's unknown, there's a huge verification process. What does all that look like? Are you contacted for that kind of a thing? I mean, these are sort of boring art questions, I think, about the market, but I think this is really important, in a way, about Churchill's work, because there are so many counterfeits. And the other day I was on HiBid where I look for, Walter Sickert Printer or Paul Moss. And I came across some people claiming they had a Churchill, and you could look at it and know it wasn't. They just slapped on a WSC, and there's an interesting premium for like terrible Churchill copies or, frauds. And I just wonder your thoughts, kind of how does that world work? I mean, it's a mystery to me.
Well, art forgery is not unique to Winston Churchill, of course, and it's been something that's been happening for centuries. But Churchill is found himself in the center of it, and in large measure because of the art market. When you mentioned the painting, the Tower at Kutubia Mosque, the one painting Churchill did during the Second World War, 1943, and gave to President Roosevelt. It ended up in the collection of Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie. And after their divorce, Angelina Jolie sold it at auction in 2021. It sold for $11.5 million,
Wow.
which is a staggering sum. And as you can imagine, everyone wants to think that they own a Churchill too, not only because of the affiliation with this great statesman, but for the monetary value of these paintings. So you're right. There are some forgeries. All of us, I think, who work in the Churchill world of collectibles and paintings, probably receive a few emails and slides. I know I do several times a year saying, "I've got this Churchill painting. Can you authenticate it?" And almost always I've had to say, I'm just terribly sorry, but that's not a Churchill painting. But the fascination with his work and the hopes that you might own one or find one are run high, I think. And to your point, yes, we do all collaborate. Catherine Carter and those of us who work in the Churchill field compare notes and try to track as some of the original Churchill paintings do change hands or are sold at auction. As we organize exhibitions here in North America, or like the splendid exhibition in the Wallace collection that just opened in London, we work with those who have collections to cajole owners to lend their Churchill paintings so that they can be shared with the public. And the Wallace has done an amazing job at securing some paintings, many from North America and American collections that have not been exhibited publicly before or often are included in that show. So it's a subset of the Churchill world, but an important one to be sure.
Well, one of the shows I've always wanted to try to put on, and Tim, you would be keystone in doing such a thing, and I've discussed it with Barry Phipps before, is if you could imagine with me a moment, as you know, obviously we're discussing Churchill as a painter. Well, of course, Eisenhower became a painter at Churchill's insistence. And here in East Tennessee, the East Tennessee Historical Society, of which I'm the president, one of his secretaries was from Sevierville, Tennessee. And at the Sevierville Art Center, they've got about 4 original Eisenhowers. Now, they're nowhere near approaching a Churchill. But wouldn't it be fun to have a Churchill, Eisenhower, and maybe George Bush show of sort of presidents and prime ministers in, politics through art kind of a thing? I just think it'd be a lot of fun.
It would, and we set the stage for that a couple of years ago, Warren, here at the America's National Churchill Museum at Westminster College. We had a very small exhibition of maybe 14 paintings. We included several Churchill original oils together with the portrait of Churchill by Dwight Eisenhower and the portrait of Churchill by George W. Bush, and even a small watercolor by President Kennedy. That is a beautiful coastal scene. It looks like Con Harbor or something like that. That was very Churchillian in scope and subject matter. And it was fascinating to see the public react to all these great leaders, presidents and a prime minister, who picked up a brush and found the time to paint. As you suggest, Eisenhower in particular was encouraged to paint because of his old friend Winston Churchill. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe Eisenhower had a small painting studio in the White House. And there's correspondence between Eisenhower and Churchill in the 1950s about painting. And in some of these letters, he mentions painting in passing after discussing the Korean War. It's quite something. Both men enjoyed the chance to relax, refresh. And I think that's one of the lessons that Churchill took away from painting. It was downtime for him. It was a chance to look at a canvas, frame the world, slow down a bit, observe nature and the world around him. And I think that informed and inspired his other aspects in his life greatly, as it did with Eisenhower and George W. Bush. It credits Winston Churchill's painting as a pastime for getting him into painting. When President Bush read that essay, he decided to take Churchill's advice and give it a go. And it would be an extraordinary exhibition to expand on. I really do think we should do it.
I would love, let's put a pin in that. for our audience.
So we'll be continuing this conversation in the next episode. Thanks to Tim Riley, who'll be joining us again next time. And we will be starting with the key question of how painting interacted with important moments in Churchill's life.